My PhD thesis is on the Vegetational History of the Catskill High Peaks. It's from ESF Syracuse, which was then known as the New York State College of Forestry. The college was satisfied, granted me the degree, but I was not satisfied. So I've been working on it ever since. 55 years.
That thesis earned Michael Kudish his PhD in 1971, but the research never stopped. In 2000, Purple Mountain Press published his landmark book, The Catskill Forest, A History. Now an updated 6-volume set is in the works. Mike Kudish is the authority on Catskills trees and forests, and I met him at his home/research library in Delaware County to hear about his latest research sampling Catskills bogs and radiocarbon dating peat and charcoal for even more insights into our Catskills forest past. I'm Brett Barry, and this is Kaatscast, the Catskills podcast.
Kaatscast is supported by the Mountain Eagle, covering Delaware, Greene, and Schoharie counties, including brands for the local region such as the Windham Weekly, Schoharie News, Cobleskill Herald, and the Catskills Chronicle. For more information, call 518-763-6854 or email mountaineaglenews@gmail.com. And by Briars and Brambles Books, the go-to independent book and gift store in the Catskills. Located in Windham, New York, right next to the pharmacy, just steps away from the Windham Path. Open daily. For more information, visit briarsandbramblesbooks.com or call 518-750-8599. This episode is supported by Hanford Mills Museum. Explore the power of the past and learn about the ingenuity of the historic milling industry. Watch the water wheel bring a working sawmill to life. Bring a picnic to enjoy by the mill pond. For more information about scheduling a tour or about their 2024 exploration days, visit hanfordmills.org.
Let's start, Mike, if you could please introduce yourself and tell us where we are.
Physically, right now, where we are, just outside of Arkville, New York.
And this is your home, but also doubles as a research library and herbarium. Can you explain what that means?
Well, a research library, when I retired from teaching up in the Adirondacks at Paul Smith's, I could come down here and do something that I wanted to do for a lifetime, that is work on the Catskills forest history full-time. So when I arrived here, I could do that. But I've been building a library on Catskill forests and the Catskills for almost a whole lifetime. So the library contains not only books, but papers and many, many, many maps. A lot of the material that I've written, a lot of material that other people have written, magazine articles, newsletters. Someone just made a comment to me, a friend, a few weeks ago that I keep everything. So if I write an article for a newsletter and say to the membership, consult your 2012 issue of the newsletter for that organization, my friend said many folks may not keep it, whereas I have all the newsletters going back to when I was a graduate student from all the organizations I belong to.
And everything's well organized. You have rooms that are labeled, and you even bought a separate house.
The house next door is for non-Catskills materials, so that all the Catskills and a few items from the Adirondacks are in this house. You asked what a herbarium is, because this house really has 4 herbaria and the library. An herbarium is a collection of dried, pressed plants, and it's used for matching unknowns with knowns, plants that come in and are collected. I have people coming here to use various portions of the herbarium. There are 4 of them. One is woody plants, trees and shrubs. It's primarily wood and bark. And then I have an herbaceous plant, mainly herbs, wildflowers, ferns. That's in another room. And then I have a bryophyte herbarium, that's mosses, primarily. And the 4th one, it's a collection of dried and dead plants from peat in bogs, and that's in the stockroom. So there are 4 herbaria.
Tell me how you came to study trees, specifically Catskill trees.
My PhD thesis is on the Vegetational History of the Catskill High Peaks. It's from ESF Syracuse, which was then known as the New York State College of Forestry.
And why did you
choose that
Catskills topic? Yeah.
Well, I had done some recreational hiking here for several years, even when I was an undergraduate. And when it was time to get a thesis together at ESF, my professors were pushing me to get going on a thesis. You need to start your research. Well, it took me a while to find a topic. But once I did, I've been working on it for 55 years. And they were satisfied. The college was satisfied, granted me the degree, but I was not satisfied. So I've been working on it ever since. The problem I was trying to solve when I was a grad student has expanded. And now it's a lot larger, covering a larger geographic portion of the Catskills in a much greater span of time.
What was the initial research?
Well, climbing peaks from a recreational point of view, just like most hikers do, I noticed that from one mountain summit to the next, which could be less than a mile from away and about the same elevation, the forests were all different. One summit would have spruce and fir on it. Another summit would have fir without the spruce. Another would have neither spruce nor fir. Another would be all hardwoods, meaning trees that lose their leaves in the winter. And of all the hardwoods, some of the summits had sugar maple, some did not. Some had red oak, some did not. The mountains were close together very often and of a similar elevation. Climate was very similar. So I had to start looking into why. I just wondered why. So that was the thesis. No one had ever figured it out before. Some people had done some sample plots, but no one actually mapped what was on each summit. So I went around all the high peaks and some of the lower peaks and just took vegetational samples of what was on the summits. But as far as actually figuring out why the summits were all different, that didn't happen until I moved here and retired. And I could really study it full time. I had fewer obligations, like full-time teaching.
Okay, so what did you discover about why the peaks are so different from each other, and is that unique to this area?
Oh, I think it's unique. Certainly, I think to North America, if not for the world. There's no place like the Catskills. In the Adirondacks and the mountains of northern New England and north into Canada, into the Maritime provinces and Quebec and Ontario, if a mountain is at a certain elevation on the top, one can predict without having climbed it what's going to be on the top. And when you get up there, there it is. In the Catskills, it didn't work. And south of here, when you get into Pennsylvania and the mountains of the southern Appalachians, their difference is because they were not glaciated. So everything is a lot older down there and different rules, different things going on, different species in some cases. The Catskills are the southernmost populations of boreal forest, spruce fir forest in eastern North America that's been glaciated. You get south of the Catskills, you lose the glaciation.
How did the glaciation affect what types of species we're seeing today?
Well, everything was wiped out. There was nothing here.
Mm-hmm.
So everything had to migrate in, primarily from the south and from the southwest. What is now from New Jersey and Pennsylvania came in here.
As seeds?
Yeah, the seeds would blow out ahead of the trees, and the forest would migrate maybe tens of yards, hundreds of yards each year, move north, and the seeds would be thrown out ahead of it. Those seeds would germinate into trees, and when those trees grew up, they'd shed seeds which went out north ahead of them, and the whole forest basically moves. The individual trees don't, but their offspring are displaced to the north or northeast so that the whole forest does move. They're not like animals where the animal actually can pick itself up and move. The plants can't do that. So the distribution of seeds or spores has to do that for them.
What kind of time periods are we talking here when the glaciation occurred, when the ice sheets moved back and the trees started moving in?
Okay, we know that. I've got plenty of radiocarbon dates and plenty of bogs. We were out of the ice at 15,000 years. And For about the first 1,000 years, I'm still working on that. I think we were in what was known as a Arctic tundra and spruce parkland situation for about 15,000 to 14,000. Tundra is vegetation that is not forest. It's small stuff, little shrubs and herbs and grasses and sedges and mosses and lichens, and it's only maybe ankle high or knee high at the most, maybe a little taller. And then the forest comes in later, and generally not in one huge continuous mass. The forest often comes in what we call with a spruce parkland. And what that is, you have individual spruce trees and individual groves of spruce trees which dot the tundra. And for roughly the first 14,000 years, I cannot find much tree material in my fossil plants in the bogs. But once you hit about 14,000, 13,900, it was like an explosion here. The forest just moved in, and fast. So one would think, well, maybe the northern Catskills were forested later than the southern because it took longer for the forest to move north. But it was very quick. I can't even see anything like that. By 13,700 years, even earlier than that, we've got species as fossils which are here today. So by 13,900, 800, 700, we have yellow birch, we have hemlock, we have red spruce, we have balsam fir. And not far behind them, we have other plants like what we call red cherry or pin cherry. And then there are blackberries and raspberries and a bunch of bog shrubs. And we're getting fossil plants in the bogs, and they can be radiocarbon dated and identified.
When you say 13,000, 14,000, that's from today?
Yes, back.
How do you think the trees have evolved in that time, or have they? You know, we had hemlock then, we have hemlock now. Are the trees different?
I would think over a period of time of 13,000, 14,000 years, and I'm not a geneticist, I don't think much. Because if you look at the fossils, they're pretty much the same what we have today. You can't really see a difference. I would think you'd have to go back to really see differences. Certainly hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years.
Before you discovered bogs and started your bog research, you were getting all your information from just a few hundred years back, right?
Super question. That's one of the big points I make when I give my bog lectures. How did you formulate that question? That's a wonderful question.
I do my research.
Good. Because one of the big points I make when I'm lecturing on bogs is that up to about the mid-1990s, I could go back only 300 or 400 years. And for several decades thought I could never go back for more than 300 or 400 years. And the evidence would be, first, living trees, the oldest trees, will live 300, 350. 400 is almost impossible here. But 300 years is possible for a few species. So the trees will tell you they've been there at least for 300 years. Another source of information would be published literature from people who were exploring the Catskills in the 1700s. There's nothing going on in the 1600s except in the Hudson Valley. But when you get into the 1700s, would be the mid-18th century, you begin to get explorers. And I'm sure many of your listeners would know of Alf Evers, who's our prime Catskills historian. And when I was a grad student, Alf Evers was kind enough to meet with me in his house and give me a lot of these sources, these explorers who came through the Catskills in the mid-1700s, and I'm able to read what they had written. And some of them were fairly detailed on the forest and what people were doing and not doing in the forest. So the literature goes back about 300 years, and the trees go back about 300 years. And I thought that's all I could do until something happened in the mid-1990s. I knew some people who were doing research in the Adirondacks, And they had published a paper on their work on Adirondack lakes and bogs and wetlands and peatlands, where they were able to take fossil plants and identify them from the bottoms of lakes and the bottoms of bogs, have them radiocarbon dated, and reconstruct the history of the vegetation in the Adirondacks going back 13,000, 13,005. It's less there than here because the ice melted here sooner than it did in the Adirondacks. But still, these people could reconstruct the forest and the vegetation going back 13,000 plus years in the Adirondacks. My thought was, could I do it for the Catskills? So I started. And I remember taking a few peat samples with a shovel from a few bogs. One of them was the bog on top of Balsam Lake Mountain, which is number 301 in my catalog, the first one I studied. And I remember the day in those days, the radiocarbon dates came by postal service, not email. And I was standing at the faculty lounge mailboxes at Paul Smith College, and I opened up the first set of radiocarbon dates, and I thought 500, maybe 1,000 if I'm lucky. And I opened up and I started reading, and my mouth opened up, and I was silent probably for 10 minutes, and the faculty going in and out, "Mike, what's the matter with you?" And they were looking at me. I had this strange look on my face. I said, the radiocarbon dates are in. They said, well, so what? I said, well, one of them's over 5,000 years. I had no idea there'd be that much. Little did I know later that we're back to 15,000, but that came later. But that 5,000 was a shock. And that was 1995. So it's almost 30 years since I was able to push back the clock to 15,000 years ago.
How long had carbon dating been used for?
For dating? It goes back to the 1950s after World War II.
But no one had applied it to this material before?
Oh, yes, but not in the Catskills. There were early bog studies done by other workers in other parts of the Northeast. There was a fellow named Deavy who was working in the 50s, and some of his associates, Connolly and Sirkin. Some of these classic papers, they go back to the 1950s and 60s, and those bogs were in Connecticut, New Jersey, southeastern New York, metropolitan New York City.
But you're the first person to do it in the Catskills.
With one exception, there's a colleague, a friend of mine, Ralph Ivey, who's at SUNY New Paltz. He looked at one bog at Balsam Lake and did a bog at the base of the Catskills escarpment over by a place called Lawrenceville, which is north of Palinville. So Ralph did two bogs, and he was looking at microfossils. He was looking at primarily pollen and spores, which are microscopic. And that was what the early workers did and still are doing, is looking at what we call microfossils, fossils that are so small you need a microscope to see them in the peat. And he was using pollen and spores to reconstruct two bogs. I know he did in the Catskills. He's been since working on Maple Crest with some others. But those are the only two, and the only person I know had ever done anything in the interior or along the edge of the Catskills.
Can you define what a bog is?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's a wetland. That is, if you walk into it, you're going to get your feet wet. Secondly, it's not only a wetland, it is a peat land. And not all wetlands are peatlands. Swamps and marshes are not peatlands. Bogs and fens are peatlands. A peatland is where the dead plant material, which eventually forms peat, accumulates to a depth where you can study it and use it to reconstruct the history. In a swamp or a marsh, which are also wetlands, the peat, well, it's not even peat, it's humus, decomposes very rapidly. So there's nothing in the bottom of it that's more than maybe a few decades or at most 100 years old. Whereas in a peatland, the rotting rate is very, very slow. and almost non-existent. So you can find peat in a wetland that's hundreds, even thousands of years old, and then you would call that a fen or a bog, depending on the hydrology and the vegetation. So I work with both bogs and fens and everything in between.
What is it about a bog that preserves the material in that way? Why are things not rotting?
Or rotting extremely slowly. First of all, they're very wet, but then so are marshes and swamps. And what all that water does is it limits the number of decomposition species. There were fewer animals and fungi and bacteria that can work under all that water. But it's not only that. It's not only because there's water, because you do have water in swamps and marshes. It's the acidity. And the acidity slows down everything because that eliminates most of the bacteria and a lot of the small animals. There are certain fungi that can tolerate the acidity, but most fungi can't. There are a few that do, so that those few that can tolerate the acidity will do the rotting, and very slowly. And then there's another factor, beside the fact that it's water and acid, is a lack of oxygen. We have anaerobic conditions. The water is more or less stagnant, and there's very little oxygen dissolved in it. So you need organisms that can tolerate those very low levels of oxygen that will do the decomposition. And that really limits the number of primarily fungi, but animals and bacteria which can decompose, because it's wet, it's acid, and it's very low in oxygen. You put all those factors together, it slows everything down. And for us, it's great, because then the plant materials don't rot that fast, and you can still get a chunk of wood out of a bog that's 13,000 years old and still intact enough that you can identify it by the cell structure.
So if you're hiking in the Catskills and you get your feet wet, how do you know it's a bog and not something else?
First thing I do is I have a probe. Right outside the door here, I have hiking poles with increments painted on them, so that I want to find out how deep the peat is. I was with a friend. He wanted to show me a fen that he had found over in the Beaver Kill. And we probed it, and we found that it was running 18 inches, 16 inches at the most, and very sandy peat, or peaty sand. And he said, is it worth coming back here to pull a sample? I said, no, it's only 18 inches deep, 16 inches, which means it's probably, we're going to go back 200 or 300 years, maybe, if we're lucky, 400 years. It's not worth it. We're not going to learn that much, what the early history is. So the first thing is, how do you know it's a peatland? Probe it. See how deep the peat is. And if you're probing down with a tool, even a stick or a branch, if you can get down, or a shovel, or a ski pole, or a hiking pole, get down, you hit 16, 18 inches, and you get resistance. You hit either rocks or, more likely, glacial till, which is a combination of mineral material, sand, silt, clay, boulders, cobbles, gravel. If you've hit the mineral material, forget it. I mean, you can't get into it. You can't probe it, and it won't tell you anything. So it's primarily the depth will tell you it's a peatland. And then whether it's a bog or a fen, that's a little more tricky because they can intergrade. You can have a wetland which is halfway in between. You can have a wetland which is a bog at one end and a fen at the other. One classic wetland I've been studying for a few years is just that. It's got a fen at one end and a bog at the other. And that's a whole story unto itself, what's been happening there over the thousands of years. One difference is the vegetation. Fens are normally forested. They may have a lot of sedges, which are grass-like plants, and they usually have either hemlock or spruce or fir, or maybe no conifers. Could be just yellow birch and red maple, but it's usually a forest. And the bogs tend to have open areas to the sun. There might be a pond, and around the pond is not directly a forest, but what we call heath shrubs, Heath. They're shrubs that are maybe knee-high, waist-high, so that you have shrubs like leatherleaf, cranberries, bog laurel, sheep laurel, Labrador tea. There's a whole array of shrubs in the same family. You might have some other shrubs growing with them that will grow waist-high, maybe knee-high, ankle-high. And in it you have some unusual carnivorous plants. You can have sundews, and you can have pitcher plants. And there are other characteristics, like the cranberries that grow in the bogs. The bogs, therefore, are generally non-forested and open to the sun, and there might be a pond, or used to be. The fens tend to be forested, and there's another difference, which I've learned from my friends who are geologists, that it has to do with the water source. That a fen generally has an inlet and there's groundwater flowing in at one end, and maybe groundwater flowing out the other. So it's being fed not only by rain and snow, but it's being fed by water flowing into it from the surrounding area. Whereas a bog gets most of its precipitation from the sky, from rain. In fact, we have terms for bogs, ambrotrophic, which literally means fed by the shadows, fed by the clouds. So it's primarily rain and snowmelt fed. Whereas the fens are minerotrophic. They're fed with underground water coming in, or surface water coming in from around them, upland surrounding and carrying minerals into the basin where the bog is.
You can extract peat and charcoal from both bogs and fens?
Yes.
What's the difference between peat and charcoal?
Well, charcoal is primarily burnt wood. Peat is not burned and is not always wood. I get bark, I can get needles, pieces of leaves, seeds, pieces of cones from conifers, whole cones. You can have charcoal in the peat, shreds and pieces of it, and what usually burns is wood. So we have charcoal is burnt wood.
Can you radiocarbon date other matter that's in the peat or just the charcoal?
Oh, you can date anything.
Okay.
As long as it has carbon. You can date everything, anything and everything, including charcoal.
Seeds and pine cones and things like that are just preserved in the peat, and you can identify them.
There are different degrees of preservation depending on how much it's rotted. Sometimes you get samples of wood or bark that are so far gone, so far rotted, that you can tell maybe it was wood, but you're not sure what it is because they're so decomposed. Just as often, and in some certain peatlands, the fossils in the peat are so relatively undecomposed that you can see right away. There's one bog out in the Beaverkill. The material was so fresh. It was almost as if it had just fallen in and died just a few years ago. It was very difficult digging. It was not digging, but pushing the core down. The peat sampler was very tough going. We had to use some really strong young people to push it down and then to pull it out. And when I looked at most of the peat, it was a moss, and it wasn't sphagnum. It wasn't peat moss. It was a moss I had not seen in a Catskills bog before. If I gave you the Latin name, probably wouldn't mean anything because it has no common name. And when I looked at that moss from, 13,400 years was the bottom of the bog, the cell structure of that moss was so well preserved, it was just as good as if I had a fresh specimen that I just collected from a live moss.
So the deeper you go, the older it is?
Generally, yes.
And so I guess your practice is to go as deep as possible to see what the earliest records are?
Yes. We want to go to the bottom to get the bottom peat. Some cases, we also want to get a peat sample partway down, 2/3 of the way down, halfway down, quarter of the way down. The peat samples themselves can be about 0.5 meter, which is about 20 inches high or long. But if it's a deep bog, if the bog is 5 meters deep and you're taking a sample, it's only 0.5 meter, you only have 1/10 of it, of the story. So we might take a few samples, 2 or 3, and then look at them. And if there's something really unusual where there's a change in vegetation, then we have it radiocarbon dated. We don't radiocarbon date everything and anything. First of all, it's a lot of work, and second, it's expensive.
What do you radiocarbon? Is it one tiny piece or is it a whole core?
The laboratory wants individual fossils. So be a piece of charcoal, a piece of wood, a piece of bark, and they can be very tiny. They don't need much. If I send a sample that's 1/10 of a gram, they're tiny. I mean, they're about maybe just 1/8 of an inch in diameter. It's enough.
Where do you send for radiocarbon dating? And when you say it costs a lot of money, can you give us an idea of what that means?
Well, I used to use a laboratory in Florida, and the new laboratory is at University of California at Irvine, and each sample is $300, and they will take only 10 or more. You can't send them one sample or 8 or 9. One of their rules is we need at least 10.
So minimum $3,000.
$3,000, but you get 10 of them. The other lab that I used before that, for $3,000, you get only half the number of samples dated, but they would take one at a time if you wanted it.
How do you fund this research?
My retirement. It's not, if you think about it, I send one batch off a year or two, so $3,000, it's a lot less than I pay for food or utilities or travel, so it really isn't that much. When I was at the college, I did get a minimum grant that would help a little bit each year. And then when my aunt passed away, my Aunt Liz, she left me a little bit of money in her will for this because she knew about it and she was very much interested in what I was doing. And that ran out. So it's pretty much out of my own funds, out of my own retirement funds, but it isn't that much. I mean, if it's $3,000 to $6,000 a year, it's not $30,000 or $60,000.
Can I ask how old you are now, Mike?
Yeah, 80.
And at 80, you're still going full steam ahead.
No one told me to stop.
What do you still hope to understand or discover in your research?
I think this is really a transition time for me. And all my friends have told me to slow down on the research, slow down on the field work, slow down on the lectures, slow down on the meetings, and concentrate on rewriting the Catskill Forest History book, which came out in 2000. So that the next few years, I hope to spend most of my time writing. The Purple Mountain Press and I are planning a 6-volume set. And I'm hoping that I can get it completed because it'll be an enormous amount of work. It's basically a whole life's work summarized.
How do you go from a 1-volume to a 6-volume? Is it the way you're categorizing the information, or is there that much more information?
Both. Because since I retired, so to speak, here 19 years ago, the volume of information has just grown several times. Just for example, the sheer number of bogs. When the Catskill Forest History book came out in 2000, I had about 30 bogs. I have 125 now. That's just a sample. And also something like the number of sawmills. And there's a lot more information. I must have a number of tanneries increased that I've found and studied, so that the detail has probably gone up somewhere around 3, 4, 5 times.
And when you talk about tanneries and sawmills, are you looking at their written records?
In some cases, yes. But that's Volume 2. Volume 1's on the bogs.
Let's stick with the bogs for a minute. When you discover through radiocarbon dating that a piece of charcoal, a piece of burnt tree, is 14,000, 14,500, 14,900 years old, what information do you get with that? Just that the forest goes back that long?
Well, it'll tell me that the forest was there and tell me what was growing in it.
Mm-hmm. And what was growing in it seems to be consistent with what's growing now.
Yes. I think I already mentioned that Emerald Bog up in the Mountaintop Arboretum, Tannersville, and many other bogs and fens. The forest has not basically changed in 13,000, 12,000 years. That's not a unique situation. I can probably find, how many bogs do I have now that are bogs and fens? I think I have 8 of them that are over 14,000 and 20 of them that are over 13. So out of the 125 that I've studied, 28 are over 13,000. And many of those have the same vegetation now as they did then.
What does that tell us?
Well, it tells us that once hemlock, red spruce, balsam fir move in, they stay, and they keep the other species out. In a few instances, hemlock has gone from a few of the bogs. In a few instances, the balsam fir is gone. There used to be a little bit. And I think only 2 instances, there's spruce that used to be in a bog that's no longer there. And if you take the bogs that never had any conifers or any evidence of conifers, once yellow birch and red maple move in, pretty much stays the same. Other species are kept out. There are many species of plants and trees that cannot grow in these wetlands. No sugar maple, no beech, no black cherry. Well, what other of our forests now? Red maple, yellow birch can do it. Beech, black cherry, sugar maple, hop hornbeam, basswood, white ash, they cannot grow in these wetlands. So they're kept out because of the water. And other species might be kept out because of competition, especially if you have hemlock, balsam fir or red spruce. There's a shade tolerance question because these conifers are very shade tolerant and they can keep out other plants that need a lot more sun. The other plants can't grow in.
It's interesting that the tree species have remained consistent. I'm more surprised that the bogs themselves, that the wetlands have maintained themselves for that long, that nothing's dried out, that the environment itself hasn't changed.
That's just it. Basically, what I'm doing on the Catskill Forest History book is the first volume will be on what we have learned from bogs. That is, if we didn't have the bogs and the fens, we would not know anything in Volume 1. There wouldn't be a Volume 1. So Volume 1 is everything that we've learned coming out of these wetlands. And one thing, if the vegetation has remained the same in many of these wetlands for 13,000 plus years, that means that the wetlands have not dried up, that the precipitation in the groundwater would be pretty much the same. Oh, you have fluctuations, but generally there are no major drastic trends and changes of drying climate or a wetting climate because the species are the same. Of course, as you know and I know, there's a tremendous interest in climate change nowadays. And my last chapter of Volume 1, before I get to the bibliography and the index, will be just on that.
What is your research telling you about the current climate discussion and where our forests may be or where our bogs and fens might be in another 100,000, 3,000 years? Is it going to change drastically, even though it hasn't in the past 15,000?
If it's going to get warmer and wetter, well, the bogs and fens will be fine. They'll be happy. In fact, they might even enlarge. If the water tables rise, then areas which are now around the edge of a wetland might be submerged, and the wetlands would even get bigger. They certainly wouldn't get smaller. It's only if the climate dries out that the fens and bogs could disappear or shrink.
Well, you've told me that you've researched 125 bogs. How many do you think there are in the Catskills? Is that a good percentage of them? And also, I'm curious what size these are. Are they tiny, or do they take up a big mass of land?
My conservative estimate is about 200. There are quite a few little wetlands that are just too shallow, like the one I discovered on Tuesday. Too shallow to sample. And there are many, of course, that I've never seen, because I haven't been everywhere. So I thought 200 is conservative. It could be 300. As far as the size of the bogs and fens, some of them are very tiny, barely a tenth of an acre. And some of them are huge wetlands. They can be a few hundred acres.
Oh, wow.
Most of them are small. Most of them are, half an acre, an acre and a half. So they're small.
How far back can be revealed by radiocarbon testing? Because it has its limits, right?
Yes. And we know what the limit is.
What is it?
About 50 to 55,000.
Oh, so that's quite far back. What's the oldest charcoal you found?
Well, the charcoal in the bogs in the Peat. I think it's the Emerald Bog Annex 407A that had some charcoal that was back around 12 or 13. So there have been forest fires here in the Catskills all along, lightning fires back then. There's a geologist, a colleague of mine named Paul Rubin, who has done a lot of work down in the Bluestone area near Onteora Pond. And he told me in one of our bog expeditions that he joined last summer that he had found charcoal in a bog up by Clarksville, which is not in the Catskills, it's in the Helderbergs. It's in Albany County, up in the hills south and west of Albany. And that's a big limestone belt which runs west, and then you have the famous tourist caves like House Caverns and Secret Caverns. It's in that belt of Lower Devonian rocks. But the caves themselves are, according to Paul, the best estimate that the caves are running maybe between 1.5 million to 5 million years old. And what he did, he's a caver. Well, I think we call him a spelunker. He goes into caves with his friends, and he found this clay in the cave, and they brought clay samples out. I have some of them here that he gave me, and mixed in with the clay were shreds of charcoal, which means that there had been a stream flowing into the cave at one time, and outside the cave would have been a forest fire burning. And some of that charcoal coming down from a stream outside the cave, bringing the charcoal into the cave, and then when the clay was deposited, the charcoal settled in with it and got mixed in with the clay. So he gave me some specimens of the clay, and I dug out chunks of charcoal. I did have a few radiocarbon dated, and because the radiocarbon date maximum is about 50,000 years, all I could be told by the laboratory is greater than 50,000 years. What happens is that the radioactive signal given by the carbon becomes so weak after about 50,000 years, they can't measure it.
So this charcoal that you have here is greater than 50,000 years. So is there any way to test it beyond?
There has to be other ways of testing it. There are other radioactive elements. I forget which one the geologists are going to use, but the estimate now by the geologists is that those caves are a few million years old, between 1.5 million and 5 million. So it's before the Pleistocene. Now, we're supposed to have had 4 glaciations, so it probably predates all 4 of them. It's older than all 4.
How long have trees been on the planet?
Well, the Gilboa forests and the Karo forests are here in the Catskills. Devonian, 385 million, 380 million, but they're just totally different trees. What I think is unusual about the charcoal in Clarksville Cave, which is a few million years old, is I try to identify the tree, the wood, and I think it's a conifer, was an evergreen, but it's nothing that we have here today. It doesn't match spruces, firs, hemlocks, cedars, pines, yews. It's just different. And I did quite a bit of correspondence last winter with experts on wood anatomy. One fellow was from Argentina. The other was with the New York Botanical Garden. And there was a lot of emails and correspondence and material going back and forth. One possibility, and we're not sure yet, is that it's a genus of conifers known as a podocarp, P-O-D-O-C-A-R-P, a podocarp. Podocarp forests now are limited to Central and South America. But apparently we know they were in Western Tennessee. Different workers have found studies there. And I looked up a book that I happen to have on the New Jersey Pine Barrens, and there were podocarps found in the New Jersey Pine Barrens a few million years ago. Not 1,000, but million. So they were here in the U.S. They were in New Jersey and they were in Tennessee. So it's not impossible we had podocarpus forests in New York. This is millions of years ago.
What do you see when you look at it in the microscope that gives you indications of what species it is?
I'm looking at the wood, and I'm looking at the cell structure, and the unusual thing about the wood of this charcoal that came out of Clarksville is there were no growth rings. Now, all our modern conifers in New York State have growth rings. That means the tree grows in the summer and then stops in the winter and grows again the next summer. And in the spring, it produces different size cells than it does in the summer. So you can see differences in the texture of the wood. That's why you can count rings.
So does that mean that 1.5 to 2 million years ago, the climate was consistent throughout the year?
That's what it suggests. If I'm reading it right, and it is a podocarp, I'm looking for a conifer that can grow all year. There are no dry seasons and no wet seasons, or there'd be no summers and no winters. So this is going back not 10,000, 15,000. This is going back millions of years when the climate might have been warmer and consistently so, almost subtropical. This would be millions of years ago. If this turns out to be the case, then I think we got a big find. And the reason is that no one, to my knowledge, knows what was here in New York State of forests between the Devonian, which is 380 million years ago, and what we have post-glacially. There's a big blank. This may be the first time we have an inkling as to what was here millions of years ago. So this is really big if it turns out to be right.
When will you know, and how will you get to that information?
Oh gosh, I need an expert who could really identify Podocarpus wood. And because it doesn't go here in the U.S., I'd have to find someone on the ship samples to South America, or I don't have the time to work on it, really.
Well, that's fair. Remember, Mike Kudish is working on a 6-volume update to his book, The Catskill Forest, A History. I asked about his schedule for publication.
I'm hoping that perhaps we can get Volume 1 done by the end of this year or 2025 next year. I don't know if the publisher can do it. Depends on how many other books they're doing. But I'm hoping if I can get 1 volume done a year, but I have to stop almost everything else to be able to do that. The question is, will the publisher be able to do it? Depends on their workload.
You've identified that there's going to be 6 volumes. Do you know what they cover?
Oh, yes. It's all worked out in quite a bit of detail.
Can you give us a hint, a little preview of just the main subject areas?
Well, Volume 1 is on everything we've learned from the bogs that we would not know if we didn't have the bog studies. Volume 2 covers the whole Catskill region, just like Volume 1, covers the whole region geographically. And there are 4 divisions or 4 sections that are not necessarily all that closely related. The first section is on Native Americans and their forest fires and how they affected the forest. The second section is on how the Europeans affected the forest, which means farms, European farms, tanneries, sawmills, furniture factories, acid wood plants, bluestone quarries, all the industrial that the Europeans brought in. The third section is on the first growth forest, the forest that no one could get to or no one wanted. And the fourth section will be on the ecology and the present relationships among the common dominant species, like what's going on between sugar and red maple, between hemlock and its contemporaries, more of a contemporary ecology of the different major plant species.
So that's just the first 2 volumes.
That's the first 2 volumes. Volumes 3 through 6 are geographic quadrants. We're taking the Catskills and we're dividing them up geographically into 4 sections. Volume 3 would be southeastern Catskills, which is primarily Slide, Panther, Peakamoose Mountain, the Ashokan Basin. Volume 4 is northeastern Catskills, which is basically the Greene County mountaintop. Volume 5 is the southwestern Catskills, where we are now, from here southward and westward, Balsam Lake Mountain, over to the Beaver Kill drainage, Dry Brook, Mill Brook, Willow Weemock areas. And the final volume, hopefully I'll get to it, I'll have the energy to do it, is on the northwestern Catskills, which is basically Delaware County, towns of, say, Middletown, Andes, Bovina, Stamford, Hobart area, Roxbury.
Mm-hmm. So by looking through those volumes 3 through 6, the reader would be able to really dig into a specific mountaintop or region to find out what the forest history was in that location.
As much as I have and will have by that time.
Do you consider this 6-volume set your life's work? Or your,
Yes. if I had another 20 years, I could get together with some people and we could do the same for the Adirondacks.
You told me at the beginning of this conversation that hiking the Catskills is what led to your interest in the tree history in the Catskills. Is that right?
Yes.
So now, kind of coming full circle, you're still hiking quite a bit for the research. How much do you get to hike, and is it still something that you do for enjoyment, or is it...
It's a lot of work. Very rarely will I do a field trip for enjoyment or recreation. It's all work. And then when I come home, I've got just as much to do as a follow-up. It's all work. But then when you discover something, it becomes worth it. For example, on Tuesday, a friend of mine and I, he had found this grove of very large hemlocks and wondered if they had been ever touched by the bark peelers, by the tanners. And by the size of them and by other situations, we figured out that no, it's original growth forest. And what's odd is that it's not very far from a public highway. And then we went a little bit farther, and my gosh, the whole forest in there at the south end of Woodpecker Ridge was untouched. And we found what may be the second largest sugar maple in the Catskills. We were measuring trees. We had hemlock and a sugar maple that were running 46 inches in diameter. And yellow birches were running a little bit smaller. But to this late day, we've still finding original growth forests in the Catskills that no one had ever cut over, burned over, farmed over, logged over. So that makes it worthwhile. Except if the information comes in too much too fast, then it's exhausting.
And is there a takeaway that you would hope that people living in the Catskills would know about the trees around them? Something that I would imagine that most people don't know much of anything about the species that grow around us. What do you think people would be most surprised to realize, or that you're hoping to impart to the broader population? There's a lot of questions in there.
Yeah. One is, and maybe I can end this interview with a partial joke, it's the behavior of trees with respect to each other, that they're all different. They all have different personalities, different preferences. If they grow together, that means that their preferences overlap. And I remember telling a friend of mine who had just given a guest lecture at SUNY Delhi. And I said, well, maybe SUNY Delhi should open up 2 whole new departments, not individual teachers and not courses, but whole departments. One on red spruce behavior and one on balsam fir behavior. And just study the behavior of individual tree species, just like they study the behavior of individual domesticated animals and people and so forth. The joke was that it should be a whole department because there's so much that there are interrelationships among plants. A lot of it is competition, not all of it, and that there are relationships that are kind of subtle because plant-plant relationships aren't as obvious as animal-animal relationships.
And communication, right? We're learning about how plants communicate with each other.
They can, underground through mycorrhizal fungi, but it's not all friendly. It can be and helpful, but it doesn't always have to be. There's still competition going out there. That's a whole other topic.
Well, Mike, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Spending some time and learning about this amazing research, and I'm really excited to see these new books come out.
Well, so am I. I just hope that I won't be so worn out that I can't do them.
All right, well, we better end this interview then and get back to work.
Many thanks to Dr. Michael Kudish, a Catskills legend. Kaatscast, the Catskills podcast, has a new story every 2 weeks, so be sure to subscribe on the platform of your choice. And if you can give us a rating, it'll help other podcast enthusiasts find us. More at Kaatscast.com and on Instagram at Kaatscast. I'm Brett Barry. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Kaatscast is supported by a generous grant from the Nicholas J. Juriad Family Foundation and by listeners like you. If you'd like to make a donation, you can do so at Kaatscast.com. Thank you.